Our coverage does continue now on this top story, as mentioned. Evacuations are continuing in Afghanistan. 7,000 people leaving since Saturday. We have those many tragic scenes at Kabul airport. After all of that, now stable, 5,000 U.S. troops are in the city. That's the reinforcement force needed to get the U.S. completely out of Afghanistan, while the incoming Taliban is facing protests and some flag waving. But as these days grind on, everyone can see there are tragic costs of leaving. There is a logistical nightmare and a political vacuum, which puts this country right back in the hands of the Osama bin Laden protecting extremist Taliban leaders who the U.S. ousted after 9/11, as we were just discussing with Nicole. Now, that's part of why Republicans think they can seize on the Biden move, which was, of course, built on Donald Trump's Taliban deals and his own exit plan. And now Republicans are claiming this will be Joe Biden's putative defining setback.
This is President Biden's Saigon moment.
This is going to be a stain on this president and his presidency.
It's been a catastrophe.
You go to hell, Mr. President.
That may be all the expected politics. But as Nicole and I were just discussing, what I want to get into with you right now in our top story is the broader reflex across Washington among national security leaders and many in the press, which narrates our wars and how they start and how they end, to really lean into a kind of a hawkish critique of this withdrawal. Take one of the respected journalists whose headlines and stories can define presidencies inside Washington, the New York Times Washington correspondent David Sanger. Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard graduate. He's the author of 3 foreign policy books. He's listened to, for good reason. But his take, what he's writing here, is that the withdrawal and the sad images this week will saddle Biden with a problem that can overshadow everything else. So that despite Biden's vaccine march and engineering surging job growth and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, everything about America's last days in Afghanistan shattered the imagery. Defeat, screams the headline. As for that national security establishment we were discussing, well, take one of its eminent leaders, the founder of the influential Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer, talking about the risks of this fallout right now, destroying, quote, destroying Joe Biden's presidency.
What if we have a hostage crisis? What if we have a firefight? What if Americans get killed? What if we end up not being able to get all these Americans out? That destroys Biden's presidency. And there is a real chance of that happening.
Anything is possible. But the thrust of these quite common D.C. arguments is not really about what would be perfect foreign policy, but rather whether this exit policy will somehow destroy or shatter or define the Biden presidency in the eyes of the entire American public. And so this can be partly fact-checked, or at least mixed with some evidentiary proportion, which is what we try to do around here, journalism. So, as we grind through what is a tough week by all accounts, with a lot of tragedy, I will tell you here's what the evidence suggests. Even though most Americans abhor the Taliban and see there are real downsides to this tough decision, there is a ton of support for the withdrawal policy and for basically lightening the entire U.S. footprint away from these long wars. The share of people who agree with President Biden that this war became unwinnable is higher than what the public thinks on a range of big divisive issues these days, from elections to COVID policy. You can see here, 62% of Americans agree with Biden's view there on the unwinnable war not worth fighting. New polls taken during the fall of Kabul, when some of those worst images were coming out, still show more Americans, far more backing withdrawal. Ditto for a poll just yesterday after the Taliban was officially in charge and during a week when all of this criticism of the U.S. exit was everywhere. So any pollster or political scientist can tell you these kind of numbers are a floor because they come amidst this toughest part of the actual logistical withdrawal. It is not like historically we see the public randomly shift to wanting to re-engage and reinvade a country when they've left already, when the U.S. footprint has lightened. Historians say that kind of shift tends to only arrive from a big new external event, like a major terror attack. Other things can change the dynamics. A few people specifically predicted 9/11 or this pandemic. But given the track that America is on, we have evidence to see that the public does want out of these kinds of wars on a bipartisan basis. Now, I'm just doing the news. So there may be valid policy reasons on national security, or experts in different regions want to debate the best foreign policy. But as Nicole and I were discussing, Washington elites who often cheered along for every Middle Eastern war they were offered, will have to come up with something better than claiming that this week's exit at the level of public opinion in the American mind will somehow define and saddle President Biden's entire time in office.